CBSE Board, Class 11, History, Chapter 2, Part 11, Audio by Renee Matthew. The first century writer Columella taught a lot of things to the population on how to keep a reserve stock of implements and tools to help the landowners. There was a general presumption that supervision of work was actually done. And when supervision was there, the workers and slaves will work accordingly. That was the presumption. So, supervision was paramount. It was of great significance and everybody gave importance to supervising the work. To make the supervision easier, what did the Roman Empire do? That is the next part of this chapter. Sometimes the workers were divided and grouped into gangs or smaller teams. They were made into small groups, you can say. And for that also Columella recommended certain things. So they may ask you questions on what these writers recommended, and that part is very important where they can ask you for long answers. So to make the supervision easier, Columella recommended squads of 10, that is group in 10, claiming that it was easier to tell who was putting in effort and who was not putting in effort when groups were of larger size. So instead of having one supervisor for a particular group, they can actually allot squads of 10 where less effort will be taken to see who is working and who is not working. So what is the role of a supervisor? To see how the work is done, whether people are working properly. That is the work of a supervisor. So they had to have squads of 10 for that. And this shows a detailed consideration of the management of labor. There is a lot of consideration on the management of labor and how it was done. And managing labor is very important according to the first century writer, Columella. The next person is Pliny the Elder. He was an author of a very famous natural history, and he condemned the use of slave gangs because it was the worst method of organizing production. He said that you shouldn't have any slaves of gangs. No gang slavery should be there. Mainly because slaves, when they worked in gangs, they were chained together by their feet, which was not a very good thing. So Pliny was against that. Why should slaves be chained together by feet? Columella said that you can have squads of 10 to supervise. He did not say anything particular about the slaves. But Pliny the Elder told that we shouldn't have gang slavery where people will be chained by their feet. That shouldn't be encouraged at all, was Pliny the Elder's statement. Now all this looks draconian. Draconian means not very pleasant, very absurd and very terrific. We should remember that most of the factories were industrialized and they were following the similar principles of labor control that we have today. Now this particular picture shows the remains from the industrial society of Roman Empire. Some remains, some kind of utensil or making things, chopping and grinding, which was used in the factory. So labor control, whatever we saw in the Roman Empire, is prevalent even today. Some industrial establishments in the empire enforced tighter control. So day by day the rules were becoming tighter. It was not loosening the grip at all. Now, Pliny the Elder described conditions in the frankincense factories. Frankincense is a type of material or product which gave lot of fragrance. It was very costly, especially in the place of Alexandria. And he tells about the condition in frankincense factory. And he said that no amount of supervision seemed to suffice. Supervision was increasing to a very large extent, more than it was required. A seal is put upon the workmen's apron, so they were asked to have a seal on the apron or the small cloth that they had, just like the chef wore, and they have to wear a mask or a net with a close mesh on their heads. This was their uniform. And before they're allowed to leave the premises, they have to take off all their clothes and give it back to them. So that was the condition of how the workers, how the slaves were usually working in the factories. Not very good. And supervision was done for these people also, where how they dressed, whether they wore the aprons properly, whether they had the mask, whether they had the net, and all these things were checked upon. The meaning of the word draconian is given. It is a historical term. Harsh. It was called so because of an early 6th century BC Greek lawmaker called Draco. There was a lawmaker called Draco who prescribed death as a penalty for most crimes. So death was a penalty for most crimes, even for the slaves and the laborers. So that was the condition of all these people. So that is how they described slavery in those days, and how it came about also is very important. Agricultural labor. Agricultural labor was really tiring, it was fatiguing and disliked also. Why was it disliked? Because the famous law of the early 3rd century, edict means law. 3rd century refers to Egyptian peasants deserting their villages in order to engage in agricultural work. So many peasants deserted their villages and they came to work in the agriculture. Agricultural work was not a bed of roses. It was really tiring. People made them work. You can see the pictures here. This is a representation from the Roman agricultural labor, which was really tiring. Even here, large acres of fields were asked to be plowed and worked upon. The same was probably true with the factories and the workshops also, where the workers were really finding it very tiring to work in these places. Now, there was a particular law which was imposed. The law is 398. Now, this particular law asked the workers to be branded. That is, if they worked well, they were branded. They were given a kind of seal. So they could be recognized if and when they run away and try to hide. So maybe a kind of painful seal was put on the workers, where when they tried to escape, they will be caught immediately. So that was a condition. It was like a commodity that human beings were treated. You had a number, you had a kind of mark, a trademark on your body, which was really painful. And if you ever tried to run away, you were really caught. And many private employers cast their agreements with workers in the form of debt contracts. So many employers, the kind of trick that they used is, they used to have a contract with their workers. The kind of contract that they had with the workers is a problem. It's a big problem maker, because they told that they had to pay a huge amount of money to these workers, the employees. So let's look at the statement again. To be able to claim that their employees were in debt to them and thus ensure tighter control over them. So if a particular worker was going to run away, they will say that you have to pay me a lot of money. Even if they did not have to pay any money, they will say that you have to pay a lot of money. They will make false contract and say you are debted to me. You have to pay a lot of money, so you have to work here for the rest of your life. So the control over them was really tight. They were not able to run away. Even if they say, or even if they did not have to pay any amount, they were forced to do so. So that was the condition of the laborers. They were forced to pay huge sums of money. An early 2nd century writer tells us about these workers. Thousands surrender themselves to work in servitude, although they are free. So many people were actually free. They were freed men. But many people were forced to surrender. Even though they just ran away from the fields, they were asked to come back and work for these people. They were under servitude without any good conditions of working. That was the condition of the laborers and the workers. So it was really tiring and fatiguing. Now here there's a picture given from the early Roman Empire on the poor families. The house was not really good in good condition, not hygienic also. They lived in really bad state of both health and living conditions. In other words, lot of the poorer families were put into debt contract, or they were bonded in debt in order to survive. So if they did not oblige, if they did not allow the employees to have a debt control over them, they will not be able to survive. They will not be paid for their basic needs. Now, one of the recently discovered letters of Augustine, we learn that parents sometimes sold their children for work into servitude. Even children were asked to go and work for a period of 25 years till they matured. So that is not allowed now. Child labor was really prominent in Roman Empire. So the status of the poor families was really bad. It was not at all good, not at all advisable also. Now Augustine asked a lawyer friend of his whether these children could be liberated once the father died. Suppose the father died, because the family is forcing the children to go and be under servitude, right? So once the father died, is it fine for the children to be liberated so that they can go and study or maybe do something else? So that was the kind of command or kind of guideline given by Augustine. Rural indebtedness. Okay, that is like they were asked to be into a bond, into a contract of paying debt. I told you about that earlier itself. A kind of contract with the employees. It was far widespread. To just take one example of rural indebtedness, in the Great Jewish Revolt of 66 CE, the revolutionaries, that is the people who really wanted a change, destroyed the money lenders' bonds to win popular support. So they came together as a flock and they destroyed all the bonds of the money lenders. You can see a kind of depiction of the money lenders and the people who were under servitude over here from the Roman Empire. And this speaks a lot. Look at the way they are portrayed. So, when people agitated, when there was a kind of insurrection, people could not do anything against them. They came together, flocked, and they were actually violent. Again, we should be careful not to conclude that the bulk of labor was forced in these ways. It was coerced in these ways. Bulk of labor was still going on in spite of all these kind of rivalry. It was not at all put down. It did not subside in spite of all this rivalry. The late 5th century emperor, his name was Anastasius. Okay, Anastasius built the eastern frontier city of Dara in less than 3 weeks. A very powerful emperor. He built the eastern frontier city of Dara in less than 3 weeks by attracting so much of labor from all over the east by offering high wages. It was really impossible for an emperor to build something in less than 3 weeks, right? Especially in those days when technology and all these things were not there. Even with technology, it is very difficult to build such huge structures. So Anastasius, what he did is he attracted labor by offering them high wages, especially in the eastern frontier city. So from the papyri, we can even form some estimate, that is the remains of the papyrus from Egypt. We can see how widespread wage labor was in many parts of the Mediterranean because they wrote documents in the papyrus and the remains are still there by the end of the 6th century, especially in the east. So in the eastern frontier city of Dara, this particular statement is very important. Labor work was more prominent and Anastasius was a person who attracted the labor by offering high wages. Very important point. Okay? Social hierarchy. Can you see the hierarchy here? The senators, equites, plebs, and the slaves. Look at the number. Now we have to stand back and look at all the social structure of the empire and how organized it was. They were good in organizing and structuring and all that. Tacitus described the leading social groups of the earlier empire as follows. Tacitus, a very important person. Now, he said this is how you have to go about. Senators were fathers. Leading members of the equestrian class was there after that. Then the respectable section of the society, that is the plebs, were there. And then you have the slaves and they were attached to the houses. So once again, let's revise. Senators, equites, okay, equites, equestrian class, respectable section of the society known as plebs, and then the slaves came in and they were attached to the house. This is the picture of the great thinker Tacitus. Over here it is given. Unkempt lower classes were known as plebs sodida. Unkempt lower classes. He tells us that they were addicted to the circus and theatrical displays, and finally the slaves. Okay, so you can see that there was another class in between the equites and the plebs, which is not given here in this diagram. Senators were there, equestrian, that is a less respectable, the kind of respectable section of the house, and then comes plebs. Plebs were unkept lower part of the society, and then comes the slaves, okay? So they were more into circus and theater, and they were more into performance. And then finally the slaves. So look at the position of the slaves, very bad, right? Now in the 3rd century, early part of the 3rd century, when the Senate numbered roughly 1,000, when the number was 1,000 for the Senate, approximately half of all senators still came from Italian families. So Senate was still there, it was still powerful, and many people came from the Italian families. Remember, it was not encouraged, right? So by the late empire, which starts from the reign of Constantine I in the early part of the 4th century, the first two groups mentioned by Tacitus, that is the senators, and the knights, that is the equites, had merged into a unified and expanded aristocracy. So what they're trying to say is, there was a person known as Constantine. He was the emperor, okay? Let's go to the previous slide. Tacitus told that the first part of the society was senators. Then you have the equites. After equites came the respectable section of the people, and that included the knights. Knight means like soldiers who went on horses and fought. So senators were really proud of the positions that they had. Look at the picture also, how they argued with the king and how the king was also scared of them. So now what happened is, from the reign of Constantine, this particular part of the society, that is equites and the knights, another section of the society, they both joined hands and they became one powerful group. Okay, so Tacitus told the senators and equites were similar to knights. Look at the picture given here, knight. They both merged into a unified, expanded aristocracy. And at least half of all families were of African or Eastern origin. So senators were from Italian place, from Italy, and these people were from Africa or Eastern origin. You may be wondering, how can Africans come to this particular position? It is because they started working hard. And finally they had their property and everything transformed. They transformed from the slave to the businessman, and finally they became knights. So because of all these factors, they rose up in the hierarchy if they were really smart with trade and commerce. The late Roman aristocracy was enormously wealthy, but in many ways less powerful. That is this particular aristocracy where you have a merging of senators and knights. This particular group was really powerful and they were wealthy. But they were less powerful than the military elites who came almost entirely from non-aristocratic backgrounds. Because they came from non-aristocratic backgrounds like African or Eastern origin, they were less powerful. Okay, just below the military elites because of their non-aristocratic background. So they can ask you, why were they less powerful? They had only wealth. That is because of their background, and remember, the Romans gave much importance to the background. Now we are going to talk about the middle class. Middle class consisted of a lot of people. Considerable mass of people belonged to the middle class because of the imperial service in the bureaucracy and army. They were imperialistic in nature, and they were also a part of the army because they had a lot of prosperous merchants, wealthy merchants and farmers. And you had a little bit of army also. They were connected with the imperial service. That is the people who were confiscators and all that, and the army. And remember that army was a very important part in the Roman Empire. We saw the army, the senators and the noble people, right? So these merchants from the middle class, they satisfied the imperial service people and the army. So they became prosperous. And they were mainly from the eastern provinces. So, let's recap again. From the time of Constantine I, this particular group, they merged and they were of African or Eastern origin. Senators were of the Italian origin. And then we have got middle class, they were of the Eastern province. Okay? Now again we are coming back to Tacitus, the great thinker. He described this respectable middle class, they were respected because of their position, as clients of the great senatorial houses. So they had some kind of connection with the senators also. They were clients of the houses. They used to have repeated transactions with the people from the Senate. So look at the grip that they had, the middle class people. It was chiefly government service and dependence on the state that sustained many of these families. They were dependent for government service. They used to work for the government, and you can say they were kind of fairly educated also. So they started serving people from the Senate, because people in the Senate will not work much. They belong to that high pedestal. They used to always keep in the high pedestal, and they will not do much work. So government services were given by the middle classes, and because of their dependence on the senates, they rose high in position. Below them were the vast mass of the lower classes, known as humiliors. Okay, they were known as lower. That is, all the slaves and plebs, especially the slaves, were known as humiliors. Look at this particular picture. Look at how they have got this authority over the slave. It is like carrying a dog with them. Okay, look at the kind of importance that they gave to slaves. So humiliors, or humiliated people, they comprised a rural labor force, of which many were permanently employed on the large estates. So many of these people, that is humiliors, which constituted the plebs and the slaves, they were asked to work tediously on the estates. And estates belonged to the middle class, the senates, and also the wealthy people. So the labor force was used from the rural side, and the people who constituted the rural side were known as humiliors. They were used widely on the large estates. So such was the condition of these people. And look at this picture also, how they depict the people. Very important part and very important picture, which has a lot of meaning from the early Roman Empire.